All right. Thank you for joining me on the first two parts of this resilience topic called A Memory of Betrayal or Anger as potentially the headwater, the source of this thing I've been talking about for a year or so now called resilience in these podcasts. Let's continue on with part 3 of this discussion. As I said in the last episode, at that point I left you with the statement about the commencing investigative hearing, the full honor investigative hearing at West Point for me. I'll continue on with the reading from the book, Resilience, the Beauty of Presence. Now, for full disclosure, at West Point, I had served on many types of probation a few times. For context, if a cadet receives too many academic, uniform, or discipline demerits, he goes on probation, meaning he has restrictions placed on his limited free time. The probation gives an opportunity to improve on his classroom studies, uniform maintenance, and or applied military knowledge, for example. Over a period of time, and once he has demonstrated his improved bearing as a cadet, he earns a release from probation with restored authorization to full cadet privileges. But if a cadet violates the honor code and receives a guilty verdict, he or she must relinquish the ring, turn in his or her uniforms, accept expulsion from West Point, and can never return or graduate. Whether receiving the verdict as a plebe or during the last week prior to graduating ceremonies as a firstie, a senior, if found guilty of violating the honor code, life as a cadet and potentially as an Army officer ends. No do-over or probation. One and done. The full honor investigative hearing culminates at the West Point quote-unquote Supreme Court level if the lower courts, like your company, your battalion, or your cadet regiment, doesn't rule in your favor. So, in early November 1983, the court proceedings began. Over 25 fellow classmates testified against me and reiterated their position of my unworthiness of remaining as a cadet. Only 3 classmates and friends, Octavio, Evan, and Pete, testified on my behalf. They selflessly pointed out the fallacies and impropriety of the claims against me. They also took the committee to task on the lack of evidence, due diligence, and the questionable impartial objectivity that led up to these proceedings. When the testimony concluded, the elite 13 members of the West Point Honor Committee adjourned to deliberate on my guilt and future. The Honor Committee Sergeant at Arms escorted my friends and I to a dark and dusty waiting room in the basement of the building. The room had a 1950s television, a 1960s pool table, a 1970s musty Mr. Coffee machine, and a couch from an unknown era. Evan chose the television. Pete and Octavio took to the pool table. I, physically and mentally exhausted, took refuge on the couch. I slipped into an unusual state of peace that lasted only about 30 minutes. Boom, boom, boom! What the hell? Octavio exclaimed. I had the 8-ball lined up and the sergeant at arms threw the door open. His beaming smile reminding me of the ones that started this process months ago. Time for the verdict. Follow me. So we walked back upstairs to the gallows and for the decision. Octavio and Evan stood next to me, with our arms locked in unison. Pete stood directly behind me with his right arm and right hand pressed firmly on my shoulder. The four of us stared calmly into this abyss. A sea of faceless, dress gray uniforms looking back at us with the cold certainty and depth of the Hudson River just steps away from this building. We waited for the jury foreman to render the decision. So my 20 years of life, 3 years at West Point, 3 months in the trial process, and 30 minutes for their deliberation had now reached an ego-crushing, fear-inducing crescendo. My unintended slumber in the waiting room had somehow comforted me with 4 simple words that served as seeds for this practice called resilience now. Loyalty, integrity, leading, and commitment. To self first and then to others. Those 4 words define only the thing I could ever have, regardless of the fate pronounced by the committee. The thing called presence. I did not know it then, but that West Point lesson started a process that evolved into this thing called resilience, the beauty of presence. So that concludes the recitation from the book itself about what I'm thinking today might have been that initial seed, that initial drop of water, that trouble, that betrayal, that anger, that kind of sort of academic trauma that happened back then that may have been the spark that got me to present to you this topic called resilience. So again, I kind of like gave you the spoiler alert in part 1, but that verdict that we mentioned to you earlier, oh yeah, the verdict was 13-0. 13 found me innocent and 0 voted against me. So, happy ending. I'm here, having gotten through that, having pushed through it or pushed into it to learn and to become the best I could ever be in front of you today. But thank you for indulging me in giving you that perspective, that experience that's unique to me, but hopefully it somehow relates to you on your journey. Again, the whole thing is to share with you not the answer, just the approach and the process of remaining resilient. Thank you once again. As always, stay current, stay present, and do remember, it is 8:20.